Hello and welcome to the George Silva channel, a channel dedicated to the study and interpretation of the works of George Silva. My name is Chris and I'm honoured that you're joining me on this journey. In this video we're going to begin at the beginning. Not the beginning of the works of George Silva, but rather at the beginning of the context in which the work should be understood. I will today look at two major players in the world of swords and two major players in the world of sword use that existed when Silva set out his works. His first works at least. As much as possible, this channel will use sources to confirm the interpretation set out. The primary source will always be Silva himself, and other sources will be used to corroborate what Silva says or to supply potential context when Silva does not explain himself clearly. If you happen to have a source that I've missed that can help with any of the information on this channel, share it below and I will look into it and make any additions, edits or reworks that may be required upon new information. It's no secret that George Silva despised the rapier as a weapon and a system of combat. It's erroneous that he wrote paradoxes to describe the English short sword against the rapier. Rather, his work, Paradoxes of Defence, argues the insufficiency of the rapier and its fencing system and separately discusses the sufficiency of the short sword, only briefly covering the one against the other. With this in mind, we must, before we even begin, understand what Silva means by rapier and by short sword. First the rapier, rather the long rapier. Before that, the word rapier. Contrary to popular belief, the word rapier is most likely not an Italian word and is not used contemporarily to Silva's works by Italians. Calm down, write in your comment. Saviolo uses the word because he is living in England, speaking to English readers and writing in English. So I should correct and say rapier is not a term contemporarily used in the Italian language. Unfortunately, my source does not wish to be known on this matter, but a research historian studying swords and swordplay in their correct context assures me that the word rapier is most likely a German or Germanic word used in German and English language, but not in the Latin languages of Central Europe. The word in German means either to grasp or pillage. Any theory on why they use the word to describe certain swords as rapiers would be entirely speculative, and I'm not going to play that game here today. In English, it seems to mean a sword of great length, as we can see people other than Silva lament them for being too long to draw. In 1590, John Smith states, "So our such men of war, contrary to the order and use military, do nowadays prefer and allow that armed men, pikers, should rather wear rapiers of a yard and a quarter long the blades or more, than strong, short arming swords. Little considering, or not understanding, that a squadron of armed men in the field, being ready to encounter with another squadron, their enemies, ought to straighten and close themselves by front and flanks, and that after they have given their first thrust with their pikes, and being come to join with their enemies, front to front, and face to face, and therefore the use and execution of the pikes of the foremost ranks being past, they must presently betake themselves to the use of their swords and daggers, which they cannot with any celerity draw, if the blades of their swords be so long." And in 1591, William Garrard suggests that both the arquebusier and piker must wear a short rapier and a small poignardo, for if in the midst of encounters and skirmishes they be driven to use them, their length is an occasion they cannot be drawn, unless they abandon his piece or pike, whereby he shall either lose his pike or want his rapier. John Smith kindly tells us the length of his idea of a rapier there at a yard and a quarter, which would be 45 inches long. Silva, on the other hand, tells us that the rapiers they use in the schools are 6 inches too long. As he sees the sword for a mean man to be a yard and an inch, his idea of a long rapier is 43 inches in length. Added to this, there was a law passed by Queen Elizabeth preventing the carrying in London of rapiers of more than a yard and half a quarter, which would be 40.5 inches. This is a wide range, but I personally like the idea set out in a recent video by Greg of the Edinburgh Renaissance Fencing Academy, a link for them will be below, that if the blade is over 1 metre, or 39.3 inches, then it is a rapier. This also sits well with the idea of a short sword being no more than a yard and 3 or 4 inches for taller people. With that in mind, let's take a look at the rapiers of Silva's time. I have shown this rapier in another video on another channel, but we can look a little closer at it here today. This rapier was made by Balefire Blades, and the instruction on the commission was, make me a 16th century rapier. I specifically gave no instruction that might have biased the rapier to my requirements, so again feel free to stop writing your comment. Balefire Blades have spent a long time gathering a lot of information and have a lot of resource from additional sources of measurements of original rapiers from museums, and this one was made according to an average of those measurements. The blade was requested to be 45 inches long, which is not unreasonable. The weight is 1.6 kilograms, and the flex is realistic, as this was made not to be a rapier to be fenced with, but rather to demonstrate, well, this. Many HEMA rapiers are made to be fenced with and are often made to be more flexible for safety. Whilst this works for the sport, it is wildly unhelpful for the studying of silver. Making a rapier more flexible requires removal of mass nearer to the tip and therefore prevents it from behaving in the same way as this rapier does. However, with this rapier and with the way it behaves, the things Silva mentions in Paradox of Defense make a lot more sense, and you begin to see the truth of what he is saying. The short sword Silva mentions is a very common sword for English people to carry in the 16th century. It's a cut and thrust sword with a closed hilt as described by Silva, and what we would now describe as a basket hilt. This sword was common in the time of Henry VIII and continued all the way through to the 17th century, where the hilt design was turned towards the mortuary or walloon designs. It's in the 17th century that the Highland broadsword emerges. Though the hilt design does exist earlier, the Scots really take it up a notch. In the later 16th century, there seems to be another style of hilt which becomes popular, which is this. There is an image of a procession of Queen Elizabeth and her retinue, and many of the barons and gentlemen in the image are carrying this type of weapon. In my opinion, this type of sword is not given enough publicity, research or recognition for a weapon that carried the English warrior for around 250 years. In essence, this is a very simple sword. As long as it can be, and still be functional, a hilt to protect the hand. I have two of these swords, one weighs less than 1 kilo and the other weighs 1.1 kilos. For the weight difference, both these swords behave in the same way as cut and thrust swords. The heavier one moves slower and controls the line better than the lighter one, which needs to be swifter and more cunning. It's fair to say there would be variation in rapiers just as much as there will be with the short sword in length, weight, behaviour. Having both of these swords available and correct their historic counterparts is vital to understanding the application of the system that Silva sets out. Having looked at the swords, we also need to understand the system of fencing that he is describing. Of course, for his own system, we need to follow the guidance of his work with the correct tool, and that is the goal of this channel, so we will do that over time. In the case of rapier fencing, we can look at many factors. The type of sword we have looked at, but which Italian fencing system is he talking about? There are hundreds of Italian rapier texts available, so how do we narrow them down? First, by date. Anything written after 1599 is likely not the system Silva is talking about. This is not necessarily true though, as the system would exist for a fair while before it was written down. Fortunately, we do have an interesting source to help. From 1557 to 1924, the Stationers' Register tracked the publication of every book. Mostly, that is, every book that was legitimately published had to be recorded in the register prior to publishing. A book that was registered was not necessarily published, and a book that was published, brought in from abroad or copied, was not necessarily registered. So it's not a comprehensive list of every book written, just a great resource of every book correctly published. This is one of the most valuable resources for historians and is no slouch here. By referring to the Stationers' Register, we can see that Silva's book, Paradoxes of Defense, was registered for publication in January 1599. The book was entered incomplete, so would have had to be completed before the publication, but Silva's intent was clearly to publish. His second book, Brief Instructions upon My Paradoxes of Defence, was never entered in the register. So, for whatever reason, we know it was not published. Further search suggests that the only two other books on fencing that were published in England in the 16th century were The Manner of How to Handle Weapons Safely, as well offensive and defensive, in March 1594. This is a translation of the work of Giacomo di Grassi and was published by John Jaggard. The other book was His Practice by Vincenzo Saviolo in November of 1594, which was also entered incomplete, showing the intention to publish upon completion. From my searching, these are the only two books I found published in England with regards to fencing, defence, any other manner of term or spelling that I can imagine. This is definitely one of those times where if you know or find anything new, please do share it below. Let us all know. Now, the fencing systems of both di Grassi and Saviolo are not only very similar to each other, but both work exceptionally well with the type of rapier I've showed here. We know from Silva, as well as other sources, that Saviolo was teaching in the court of Elizabeth I. We have no source that confirms di Grassi was teaching, but we can presume an interest in his fencing system existed enough to have his book translated and published into English. Whilst this is speculative, it's a reasonable speculation on the absence of further evidence to the contrary, but it appears that the most prevalent system of Italian rapier fencing in England when Silva wrote his work was the fencing of di Grassi and Saviolo, with the rapier that I presented being both average for the time and very functional for the systems of di Grassi and Saviolo. It's further reasonable to suggest that if you want to understand Silva's opinion on the rapier, then his opinions are based on this style of rapier used in the manner of di Grassi and Saviolo. Stop with the commenting, I haven't finished. Whilst this is a reasonable speculation, there are other considerations. First, rapier is being taught in English fencing schools. We know this from both Silva and the records of the Masters of Defence of London. Silva states that Bonetti has been teaching for 30 years, and this is supported further by the Masters of Defence, their first rapier prize being played here. So rapier fencing is very established by the time Silva is writing. The second is that gentlemen often travelled and sought out books. There is no reason at all to believe that other fencing books and styles did not exist in England at the time. Just because they are not published or documented to our current knowledge does not mean they don't exist. Saviolo, for example, is a Venetian and so presumably uses a Venetian style of fencing. Another gentleman went to Milan or Genoa, they may well have picked up fencing styles or works from those areas instead. To compound this same point, Italians travelled to England and brought their trades and their fencing with them, so there would have been a melting pot of many different styles available. However, until further evidence presents itself, my interpretation of Silva's works, and those that we presented on this channel as we move forward, will be on the assumption that Silva is speaking against not Saviolo specifically, which will come as a video on this channel for sure, rather that he is speaking about a fencing system similar to that of di Grassi and Saviolo, with a rapier similar to this one that I have presented. In actual fact, with this one I've presented, because that's the one I will mostly use. But that's enough for this video. We've introduced some context to help guide the study of this interpretation. I welcome constructive comments. If you have anything to add or any questions I can answer, please let me know down in the comments. And I look forward to doing more on this channel. So I will see you in the next video.